Hi, I'm Brian Russell. Welcome back to class. I want to give a brief introduction to the Ten Commandments. If you're in my exegesis of Exodus course, we're working through the Sabbath commandment in particular, and there's some other content on this. But in general, this is an introduction to what is known as the Ten Commandments or also the Decalogue. In case you didn't know, the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments appear in two books in the Pentateuch. First in Exodus chapter 20, 1 to 17, and secondly in Exodus 5, 6 through 21. These two texts are virtually identical, with the exception that Deuteronomy has its own distinct vocabulary in a couple of places, and the Sabbath commandment is longer in Deuteronomy, as there are additional protections given out to certain types of animals there. But otherwise, these are essentially identical. Now, when we read the Ten Commandments, it's important to frame them in their context. In the first case is they're not simply a list that can be pulled out, though one could do that. It needs to be read in the context of the book in which it's found. And in this case, in Exodus, it's in the context of 19 through 24, which is the initial creation of the covenant. And so when we read the Ten Commandments, we need to recognize that the assumption that the Ten Commandments makes is that these are instructions addressed to a covenant community. Back in Exodus chapter 19, verses 4 and 5, God had said through Moses to the Israelites, "Therefore, if you listen to my voice and keep my covenant," right? And so the Ten Commandments assume a covenant relationship between Yahweh and God's people. And essentially, the response of God's people to Yahweh is faithfulness or faithful obedience. And what's it mean to keep the covenant? Well, what the Ten Commandments do is they give 10 expressions of God's will, of God's absolute will. And here's a technical term for the type of laws that we find in the Decalogue or the Ten Commandments. They're called apodictic laws. These are direct expressions. You will not kill. Sort of unqualified prohibitions or exhortations. Honor your father and mother. Remember the Sabbath. You will have no other gods before me. Now, when we get a little further into the Pentateuch, there's another type of law that are called casuistic laws. These are more like case laws, in which there's a little bit more ambiguity in the sense that the laws assume different types of scenarios. So, for example, if your ox gores someone, and the Pentateuch has laws about that, there's different repercussions depending on the circumstances. So apodictic laws are sort of absolute expressions. Casuistic laws are more case-by-case applications of these absolute expressions. But these are what are found in the Ten Commandments. Now, when we talk about the Ten Commandments, it's also important to see how the Ten Commandments themselves are framed. We already talked that it's framed by the covenant, but if you look at Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, the initial statement is, "I am Yahweh, your God." And then this is defined by who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. So recognize the importance of this. What does this do? This frames the commandments by emphasizing grace and by emphasizing the identity of people. We've already talked about covenant, so we know that Yahweh is Israel's God, and we know that Yahweh had a full revelation of what that name means in 3 and 6, where it's introduced. And then we saw in the Passover account and the account of the signs how we learned about who Yahweh is, especially Yahweh's power over the gods of Egypt. And then we have this principal historical claim. Israel's laws are rooted in the claim that Yahweh brought God's people out of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. And by the way, this is a reminder then of where God's people came from. That God did for them what no other God has done, which is deliver enslaved people out of that land and brought God's people to Yahweh, to the Mount Sinai, where God has made a covenant with his people. So all of this is framed in a context of grace. Now, why am I emphasizing this for these things? For at least 2 reasons. First of all, it's important to see that this assumes a covenant community. So the 10 Commandments may be universally applicable at some level, but notice that the assumption is that is an ethic not for everyone, but for God's people who have been redeemed out of Egypt. And then secondly, this grounds Israel's faithfulness, Israel's life, not in obedience in order to receive grace, but it grounds Israel's life in obedience as a response to grace. So faithfulness is a response to God's prior grace. Now, let's take a look at the 10 Commandments. Essentially, we have laws that focus on God, and then we have laws that focus on others. Now, there's actually 3 different ways of ordering the 10 Commandments. Now, you may have learned the 10 Commandments as you grew up in your faith tradition, and they're these 3 different ways include the same verses. But what that basically gives us is, depending on, if you take all 3 and combine them, you end up with 12 commandments. You're thinking, what does that mean? Well, let me suggest. Number 1. For example, this verse here, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slaves. This, in Christian context, is the prologue to the 10 Commandments. In the synagogue, this is actually the first commandment. And so here's one of the 10 Commandments, though you may not have considered that. Now, the other places where different traditions disagree on what is what command would be 2 places. The first thing would be verses 3 through 6. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on the earth but beneath, or in the waters below. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I am the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for the sin of the parents to the 3rd and the 4th generation of those who hate me, but showing love to 1,000 generations of those who love me and keep my commandments. So here's a critical question. Are those verses 1 command or 2? So are the commands no other gods, or no idols? Some traditions would count that as 1 command. Some traditions, including the Jewish tradition, split those up into 2 different commands. And then we have, don't take God's name in vain. So these are the commandments that principally focus on God. And then the commandments that focus on others would be honor parents, no murder, no adultery, no stealing, no false testimony, and no coveting. Now, this is another place on the covet command where some traditions break this into two commandments, in a sense that it's broken into, you will not covet your neighbor's house, and then you will not covet your neighbor's wife, female servant, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. So there's a distinction made between property and persons. You may have noticed I skipped over one of the commandments, and depending on your list, it would be the fourth commandment. It would be the Sabbath commandment. I skipped over it on purpose because, in a sense, it links these two sets of commandments, because we have remember the Sabbath day to keep it, or by keeping it, or in order to keep it holy. So that's an honoring God. And then you keep the Sabbath by allowing everyone, including your animals, to have a Sabbath. So this is an honoring of others. So it's sort of as a bridge commandment. Now, you can also frame out these commandments, and I like to do this in terms of the great commandments, which would be love God and love others. And so you can see how what Jesus does in the New Testament, he takes hold of verses that actually come out of the Pentateuch. And so, like, where does it say to love God? You can use Deuteronomy 6, 4 and 5 to frame that out. And then, where does it say to love our neighbor? That one comes out of Leviticus 19:18. And then Jesus talks about these in the Gospels. One last thing on the Decalogue before I conclude this introductory video is, when we're trying to appropriate this as followers of Jesus, it's important to recognize a couple of things. Is that these 10 commandments still need clarified and applied to a context. You see Jesus doing this in some ways in the Sermon on the Mount, in particularly Matthew chapter 5, verses 17 to 48, trying to get at a deeper meaning to some of these, and in some of Jesus' other teachings. But these serve as a guide, and one of the questions you want to ask yourself is, what would a community of faith look like that ordered itself by the 10 Commandments? When you ask that kind of question and lay that out, you can create a really dynamic, missional, witnessing ethic that then allows persons on the outside, because remember, these are rules for the insiders. It allows us to organize ourselves in ways that reflect God's holiness in the world, to the world, and for the world, which then captures that identity and vocation that we saw back in Exodus 19, where God said to Israel, you're going to be my treasured possession. You'll be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. become a missional community that reflects God's character to the world, in the world, and for the world. I'm Brian Russell. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. You can put them in the comments or you can send me an email. It's my privilege to be your instructor, and I'll see you next time.